Hello, and welcome to another episode of DW FastTrack, the podcast where lawyers discuss all things legal and trending. I'm your host, Lance Anderson, a member in Dickinson Wright's Austin office, focusing on IP and transactions. Today, I'm joined by my colleague and industry expert, Lael Andara, out of our Silicon Valley office. In this week's episode, we're going to discuss artificial intelligence, in particular, generative AI. Lael, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lance. I think it's a topic that is on most people's minds. And I think what's nice about today's presentation is you've got two very unique perspectives. While we both are, members of the patent bar, your experience as being an in-house counsel and, creating frameworks and addressing the business issues that could arise is a very useful perspective in the sense that you're helping avoid problems where my role is typically in litigation, where I'm either defending or alleging that these types of tools have harmed my client. And at that point, the problem's already occurred. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Same here, Lael. I appreciate you joining me. And you're right. I think from my perspective, I serve in a lot of outside GC roles or outside general counsel roles for various clients all over the place, right? In various types of businesses and industry sectors. And what I'm seeing is, generative AI topics and issues are coming up from all facets of their business, whether it's IT vendors or other opportunities they are developing themselves. And while there's a ton of innovation that go into it, there's also just the fact that it exists out there and it will affect all of us. And so, I'm glad that we have this opportunity and look forward to jumping into some of this real quick. But before I do, as always, we want to remind everyone this is a discussion on legal issues, but it's not intended to be legal advice. So, as always, please contact your attorney should you need any counseling and advice along these lines. We hope this gets you thinking and at least helps you spot some issues that might be relevant to your business. Lael, I think we always want to start out with kind of a level set on how we approach what is generative AI and what others may think that is. So, why don't you help us kind of understand, at least from your perspective, what is generative AI? What are we talking about here?
So these are new tools using the algorithms that, have been used for years. The difference being that, I remember growing up, my grandpa used to say, remembered a time where kids didn't talk back. Well, I have never had that experience. And we're going into a new era where now computers are talking back. And the question is, should we be listening? And I think there's pros and cons. For example, last year we saw that ChatGPT passed the bar in the 90th percentile, but yet in the same year was suspended from the practice of law. And more accurately,
Yeah.
it wasn't ChatGPT, but it was the attorney who used it in Colorado that ended up being suspended because the courts found that that was not reasonable to do. So it's become at the forefront of how we are operating. Now, the analogy I like to use when I'm describing this, because there is a lot of technical jargon that I'm going to try to avoid. I do like to geek out on this because I enjoy being involved in technology. That's how I got into patents and privacy and now generative AI. But I think the analogy that sometimes helps is when you're looking at these tools, the generative AI tools like ChatGPT and Gemini and Adobe and Copilot, you have to consider that these are still early in the process, and we are not technical experts, you and I. I mean, I don't mean to speak for you, but myself, I think this is more of an analogy like a company is like the race car, and we're the pit crew that we help set up the car and we manage and help prevent risks in the operation. But anytime you understand that, you're going to have to drive fast and, achieve a certain goal, you got to have the risk built into it. And so the value that attorneys bring to the table, even though, we're not race car drivers, we are simply there to help identify and mitigate risks. And with this new technology, we also add value in helping with the strategy on the issues that arise. I've seen about a half a dozen issues that come up in these contexts. Privacy and data protection is the big one. Intellectual property rights and infringement is second. Implementation of risk management frameworks and like employee training is important. The one that's interesting to me is liability for AI decisions and actions, which hopefully we'll get into a little bit later. And then, of course, you've got the upcoming wave of regulatory compliance that I think will sort of begin with the AI Act coming out of Europe, and you're going to see more of that. Even though there are statutes, for example, in Colorado and New York that specifically address certain generative AI, it's very sector specific.
That's, I think, a great point for lawyers that are listening to this or that are trying to advise clients. It's okay that you may not know the issues or know explicitly what happens with the interpretation of some Gen AI effect, whether it's literally generated content or decisions that are made. This is, I think, as you mentioned, it's nascent. I think we're looking at a situation where I have a client that likes to say, we're building the plane while we're flying it. And there is a ton of gray area. And for those of us that are in the intellectual property space, we're seeing some of the initial policy frameworks begin to arise here, which is primarily first and foremost, what level of human intervention do you need before you're attributed certain intellectual property protection or rights? And so, starting literally at the basics, what do we have here in the form of an intellectual asset? It is still an open question. And so for us to now say, okay, we have data and privacy issues, we have impacts to business, we have valuation discussions with corporate transactions like mergers and acquisitions. There's a lot that needs to come together in the sense of both regulation and policy, as well as case law, frankly, which is a great tool we use in the legal profession to interpret those laws and regulations. So between all of that, it is very important we all understand this is early. Some of these early returns are very promising. Some are very scary, and we're seeing some of those in the headlines. But I think more importantly, we're also seeing that from a client perspective as they do business on a daily basis. It's more and more important.
Yeah, and I think from a legal perspective, the patent office and the copyright office have both said, using these tools, you can't get authorship on copyrights or patents. What's unique about this for businesses is, most businesses are not going to be in a position to build out these tools. They're going to have to reach out to someone like you to help go over the agreement with, the large companies that actually spent billions of dollars to build out these models. I think last year was like 10 billion investment in, the common ones that we think about like Gemini and Chat GPT, and how you get protections and what your liability is. For example, there's the copyright shield that's offered. And I know the Copilot offers certain indemnification for using their tools, but you really want to have an attorney look at that and see how strong those protections are and whether or not they can rely on that. Because the other part of this equation, it's not just legal, it's also reputation in the sense that, even if you have those protections, if something goes wrong that reflects poorly in the market, that can harm your reputation. And that can be, there's that old saying, it takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but seconds to lose it. And for example, the attorney in Colorado probably spent years and years finally passing the bar and practicing law. And in that one brief where he relied on the tool without understanding it, he was suspended from the practice of law. And so understanding those risks are going to be very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're hitting it on the head, and I think it's happening in real time. So let's look at what we're dealing with as a law firm. Okay, we're lawyers. We're a group of lawyers that have clients, and we have clients that work with several of us within the law firm. And with a firm this size, we do have relatively sophisticated tools from the IT perspective, including opportunities to embrace artificial intelligence. Now, that's been around for years, right? We have certain aspects of our litigation and other legal research software that's very intuitive and utilizes aspects of AI. The generative AI pieces that are coming in. It's funny, you'll have clients that'll say, "Hey Lance, FYI, we're concerned about privacy and we're concerned about, security and confidentiality of our data. Just so you know, we do not want you using any of our client information in any large language model or other generative AI technology, based on that alone." And then you have the next client saying, "What are you doing as a law firm that's ensuring you're embracing these new technologies to maximize your potential and our efficiency collectively?" Right. So these are kind of conflicting things. And so when you start talking about the risks associated with jumping all in, I think it's important and inherent in all of us to kind of be cautious, but be cautiously optimistic in order to see the potential without, overly exposing yourself to risk.
Well, there's a couple of good analogs to this issue. I mean, the one that comes to mind most immediately is the internet. This is now doing billions of dollars of revenue per year, coming up on trillions, but it was a gradual process, in the development. The other one is autonomous vehicles. It's been a slow process to learn the technology. And it's just understanding that generative AI is much the same beast in the sense that you have to understand its limitations and that it's still ramping up. You can trust but verify how you're using these tools because, for example, Air Canada had an issue where they had a chatbot who interacted with a client whose grandmother had just died. And the chatbot had said, listen, don't worry about it. Travel, go to the funeral. You have 90 days. When you get back, we'll take care of it. Well, that was not their policy. And so when the passenger got back and being savvy, he had taken a screenshot of the message with the chatbot. He tried to get the bereavement rate, and the company said, no, this is not us. This was the chatbot. We didn't do this. This is contrary to our policy. The Canadian Transportation Agency disagreed and ruled in favor of the consumer. And I think you're going to see that policy be implemented where if you're a business who's going to use these tools and they make representations with your name, you are going to have to live up to those representations. And so it's a risk you have to consider when you're building out and deciding how to use these tools. Specifically, chatbots are going to be probably the main interface with consumers on the marketing side for most companies. And this is a really good example of, being careful and having limitations on how far that can represent your company.
You're right, and I think you also start to see some of the current trends and other stories in the news, and I think, these deep fakes and the ability to commit what appears to be very accurate, renditions, that are otherwise untrue. I mean, you're going to see policies begin to help address that, and it could range from things like, significant civil liability to perhaps strict liability associated with that being per se defamatory or things like that. Like we were saying earlier, it affects everything, whether it's audio, video, the written word. And like I said, we're also struggling on the intellectual property implications, trying to find that balance of what human intervention is necessary to equal those rights. And in the meantime, there's just so much new stuff coming out that you can't help but be excited about the possibility.
Absolutely. I think it's important to understand, the life cycle of generative AI for a company would be you have the idea of the concept, you have the proof of concept, and then before you go public or before realize it, you should confer with your attorneys to discuss the types of risks we talked about, the privacy, the liability for the decisions that AI makes on your behalf. Because, one of the risks you have, and this is where, from my perspective, is you have potential laws out there that can make you liable for, how the data is collected, not only your chatbot, but for example, in California, we have Penal Code Section 502, which is a criminal law, but it has a private right of action where if, for example, your generative AI is collecting data on the consumer and it doesn't meet the criteria of the statute, your company can be on the hook for the tune of $1,000 per incident. Now, I actually was involved in litigation where the client had used a product it was a trial. They hadn't even actually bought the full product. And simply using the trial resulted in them being sued under the statute. Understanding that, just conferring with legal as to how you implement this, even on the trial basis, is important.
It absolutely is. And speaking of someone who's using generative AI on a trial basis, just like most law firms, we're working hard to, find the best practices to operate with the most capable technology applications that can harness this type of generative AI power. Lael, you mentioned kind of the AI Act coming out of Europe in its draft form, and I believe it's a great first step in giving folks, including here in the United States, some tangible way to look at how regulation or other guardrails will be put on the development of generative AI. There are also things happening. We mentioned the U.S. Patent Office issuing its guidelines in February. Before that, the Copyright Office had issued some positions on authorship requiring human intervention. What other guidelines or guidances are you seeing out there that we might want to pay attention to?
Well, there's also, and I think this accompanied the AI Act. Oxford University had put out a framework that was much more practical in terms of actual implementation. But the reality is, a lot of the burden that you're seeing for example, the AI Act has a certain level of transparency required, presidential executive order that just came out, emphasized the need to red team, which means you sit down with your attorney and your IT guy and your privacy and your data protection, and you identify problems. And more than likely, you're going to do this on a quarterly basis. So basically, once they come to you, they've built out their policies, their strategy, their legal agreements with whoever they might be licensing the tool from. You still have an ongoing obligation to monitor the tool to avoid, future issues. And I think if there's one thing you can see from the AI Act and consistent with the recent executive order is you shouldn't be using these tools for human resources or those types of things, because anywhere there's a danger, and that's what's nice about the AI Act, it categorized each level of these technologies and their risk factors and when they can be used and when they cannot. I think when we get some variation of that in the US, it's going to be a watered down variation of it. But I think its core principles, it's going to be documentation, transparency, and don't forget the FTC. The FTC is going to monitor everything you do. And one of the bigger risks and costs is algorithmic disgorgement. What is that? Well, there was a case the FTC brought against Weight Watchers where they found that the information that they had gathered was improper, and it wasn't simply enough to have damages. They had to basically get rid of the model. And keep in mind, these models cost millions of dollars. And as businesses are licensing the models, for example, their data sets that they're using for their specific consumer base, those are going to have value to them that if, for example, somehow they get polluted with biased information or something the FTC finds problematic, you've just lost that investment the company made. It's important to understand that even though there isn't a formal regulation, there are statutes and there is the FTC already out there for the people that are using these tools currently.
That has culminated into what's being pointed to as kind of the, US resource for a lot of this. And I think, the executive order from Biden really kind of propped this up, but that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has issued its essentially frameworks as it tries to cultivate trust in the use of generative AI. But it gets to exactly what you were talking about, Lael, in the sense of giving resources, giving a framework for risk management, giving best practices. I mean, it's standards and technologies, right? It would be great if there are ultimately certain standards and technologies for applied AI research, the kind of allocation of AI technology to the processing and management and transmission of data. That can be a good resource. I know that certain bar associations are referring to the NIST kind of frameworks that are, still in their infancy, but they're coming along. And I think the AI Act is dovetailing with some of those efforts, and hopefully we'll start to see things come together in a way that makes sense and that's palatable for those that are advising deeply in the AI technologies.
Yeah, a NIST is very important, and I think it will probably have the most influence. Again, one of the issues or risks that I talked about was you've got privacy and cybersecurity. Well, now you've got generative AI, and they're all inextricably intertwined. And NIST was at the forefront of the cybersecurity and sort of the protocols on that. So this is not, they've got a lot of credibility, and they've been involved different avenues, so to speak, but there's a lot of parallels that make their materials and their approach very viable.
And they are, yeah. And so they've, that's come together as the US Artificial Intelligence Safety Institute, which is a consortium that's being promoted through NIST. I think it'll give us all some good resources to refer to and to watch evolve. And I guess the question is, can it keep up with the advance of generative AI technology platforms? That's an open question. I don't know. It seems like stuff's happening really fast, Leo.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of this comes down to what's reasonable. In California, for example, the reference to Section 502, the policy is based on privacy and what consumers' reasonable expectation of privacy is. Those core principles being part of your design process are going to help you get it right also, in addition to NIST and just thinking about this. But I think understanding conceptually big picture, the more transparent, the more consent, and the more you control the data. So, for example, if you've got users who are doing their inputs into your tool, make sure you control those inputs and they're not being sold for advertising and they're not going outside if you want to limit your liability and your risk.
One thing you mentioned that and I'm thinking even from your most basic startup client perspective, looking to develop technology capability. I had a client recently say, we have a translation module that that helps, with this app that we're developing. And I said, well, okay, well, what's that? And they're like, well, it's chat GPT. At which point you're immediately saying, okay, well, what's happening to all of that information that's getting into that and processed and then, delivered as a result. And that sounds very simple. It sounds very innocent. That would trigger pretty much all of these concerns with regard to privacy, use of information, use of protectable or personally identifiable information for that matter, as well as other work products. So it doesn't take much to realize your business is being influenced or impacted by, generative AI technologies. And it's at our fingertips. If you're a sixth grader, it's impacting how you learn and what you're doing with information. If you're a senior executive, it's impacting the deliverables that are put before you to make major business decisions. Imagine what's going to happen in the coming year or two. Again, I may be a little overexcited with generative AI potential, but for those of us that have seen it actually in use, you can see there is tremendous potential, and we just need to harness it.
Well, and if you just step back for a minute and look at the internet as it is today versus, let's say, 1995, 2000, it clearly is a very different beast than it was then. And I think that's why I think businesses can't simply ignore the technology. I think there's going to be a competitive advantages for companies who spend the money to educate themselves. Maybe they not implement it, but understand how it's developing so that when they are ready, to get on the track and do a couple of laps, they're better informed. Because candidly, getting the call from the client when they've just, hit another car, have been launched in the air 20 feet and they're about to, hit impact, there's a lot less that I'm going to be able to do to minimize the impact on a value basis versus if this discussion had been had before you started using the tool. Well, thanks, Lance. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss these issues. And thanks, everyone, for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of DW Fast Track. For more information, visit our website at www.dickinsonwright.com or check out our social media channels.